Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
Oh boy, wow, doppelganger. I guess that makes me your other co-host, Matt Bernico, for the week. It's a Freaky Friday this time. That's supposed to be next Friday, Good Friday.
Nope, Dean, it's not Freaky Friday. It's an April Fool's. I gotcha.
You got
oh my
me.
God, you must be so embarrassed right now.
I am so embarrassed. If you could see my face, it's red as heck.
That's right. You thought you were me for a second. Oh boy. Well, April 1st has come and gone, I guess. So it's not really a great April Fool's, but it was one, just the same.
It's an April 7th goof. That's really the long game, I think.
That's right. We're not on this show. We're not bound by capitalist holidays like April Fool's Day. We do April Goose Day on the 7th, and that's better, I think.
That's right. April Goose Day on the 7th. Mark your calendar for next year. I know I'm going to, so that I don't get got again.
You can't. You never, and especially with me around, you never know when it's coming.
That's right. April Goose Day, that's the worst part about it. It does move around the calendar, so it's kind of like you never really know until the trap is sprung.
Yeah, that's true. You never know until the trap is sprung. You know, speaking of holidays that move, let me tell you about a cool one that you're going to love, Dean. It's called Holy Week. What's up? Holy Week is it's a movable holiday within the Christian tradition, and that's exciting. You know, some of them are really fixed, like December 25th. That's always Christmas. But when's Holy Week? You never know. It's always coming at you from every which direction.
That's right. That's because you're getting ready for the big April Fool's joke, which is the resurrection.
That's right. That's right. All right, folks. You heard it here. Well, I mean, I guess you kind of did. You kind of heard it here. We're getting close to the end of Lent. This coming Sunday marks the beginning of what Christians, or at least some of us, call Holy Week. Holy Week is the time in the Christian calendar when we mark Jesus' big entrance into Jerusalem with Palm Sunday, which is this coming Sunday. And then you kind of go through the week through, Jesus' last days with the Passion, the Crucifixion, and finally you get the resurrection on Easter Sunday. Spoiler alert, maybe you didn't know. But anyways, yeah, Holy Week has got a lot going on, but it does mean that Lent is almost over and we can stop thinking about Lent, which is great. We need to stop thinking about it probably soon. I don't have any ideas about Lent left.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Running on empty.
Me too. It's been a lot. This one felt extra long. I don't know if for some reason it was, or it's just the moment in time. But it's been a long Lent, and this time around, as we are sort of getting around the bend here, we're going to focus on kind of an interesting story that comes out this time of the liturgical calendar, which is Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem. So we already did the crucifixion way too early, and so now that's right, we are grasping at straws. But this one, I think, is actually pretty relevant to the podcast, believe it or not. So a lot of Christians make a lot out of this moment in the Lenten story, and for good reason. There are a lot of strong political themes going on in the story when Jesus finally gets to Jerusalem. It's kind of like a pinnacle moment of a lot of different themes. And specifically, there are some interesting themes around Palm Sunday as the kind of liturgical celebration of that story. Lots of symbols around rejecting political power, and the discourse around it is all very interesting. It's kind of a mixed bag. I found it to be very politically motivating as a weird young Christian person at one time in my life. And there's a lot of interesting talk too about things like performance and activism and street theater all tied up in this. So we're going to get to all those themes as we go. But Matt, I don't know, probably not everybody's a church person or knows this particular Bible story. So why don't you give us the rundown? What's going on in Palm Sunday? What's going on when Jesus gets to Jerusalem?
Yeah, let me tell you. Okay, I'm going to read the Bible here. Get ready, everybody. Yeah.
Well,
this is from Luke 19. You can find this story, though, in all four of the Gospels. This is one of those big ones. So you know it's important when it's in every single one of them.
It's true. It's real.
They all figured this one was going to make it into the big book in the end. All right, so this is Luke 19. Jesus comes to Jerusalem as king. Jesus went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. As he approached Bethphage and Bethany at the hill called the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, why are you untying it? Say, the Lord needs it."
You can use that whenever
if you need
want,
a thing,
by the way.
And you see it, you can say the Lord needs it, and you can take it.
when you're walking around the grocery store, you just grab that a little, a few items, and you can say, "Look, the Lord needs it. Don't worry about it."
You're at Costco, and you want a second sample of the mini pizza. You say, The Lord needs it.
Why are you picking up that extra toothpick?
Okay. Those who were sent ahead went and found it just as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, the owners asked them, "Why are you untying the colt?" Man, Jesus saw this coming. They replied, "The Lord needs it." They brought it to Jesus. They threw their cloaks on the colt and put Jesus on it. As he went along, people spread their cloaks on the road. When he came near the place where the road goes down the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest. Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." "I tell you," he replied, "if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." As he approached Jerusalem, he saw the city and he wept over it. "If even you had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you." Whew. Jesus, he's doing a lot of things in this one. The disciples, they're getting a donkey for him. Jesus is kind of cursing Jerusalem. Yikes. Right after this is actually when Jesus does cast people out of the temple. So he pulls into town on a donkey, which means something. We'll talk about that in a minute. He says a mean thing about Jerusalem. And then he immediately goes to the temple and he throws a bunch of people out of it. So it's a pretty wild day, a pretty busy one. A lot of things going on for sure.
The talk of the town.
Jesus is not here to, like, I don't know, tell people to, like, pray a silent prayer and kind of get out of their lives. He's kind of doing something a lot different. So all that to say, Christians on the left have taken, I think, this part of the story, and kind of interpreted it in some really interesting ways. And I think there's a lot of, I don't know, yeah, like you said at the very beginning of the show, Dean, some very interesting, politically motivating ideas in it. Um, I don't know. There's a sense in which when Jesus comes into Jerusalem on the donkey, he's a king unlike other kings, right? There's sort of a backwardsness to it.
Yeah, exactly. There is a backwardness to it, and I think that is what attracted me to it as like a young Christian person trying to figure out what it means to have sort of a different political reading of the text. Um, it is a weird passage. When you're in the Catholic Church, like when I was growing up in the Catholic Church, it's really fun on Palm Sunday because the priest gets his big palm and he puts it in the water and he throws water around everybody, and you got to sit in the splash zone. And when you're a little kid, you want to get as wet as possible. It's a great time. But as I got older, and especially when I had kind of an evangelical detour where I got really into the Bible, I thought there are so many interesting little I don't know, interpretive like keys to the story that weren't very obvious when you're just concerned with getting all that good holy water. So the maybe most accessible text that brought this out for me at first was, like probably many others, this wild book Jesus for President by Shane Claiborne, who is an interesting guy. He's out there still doing his thing. He wrote this book, Jesus for President, around the time of the Obama election. Is that right? Like right before 2008, in the midst of Bush years. It's a Bush era text for sure. So like right before Obama got elected. For example, okay, well maybe okay. Let's get back to the story in a minute, but we should set the stage here a bit, right? It's like the late aughts, the late 2000s. And George Bush is the president. Christians don't know what to do, like progressive Christians, because there's this big wild evangelical guy destroying Iraq and Afghanistan. And out comes somebody like Shane Claiborne and a handful of lots of other people who were kind of doing this like really unique, like biblicist Christian anarchism. So, there's a long tradition of Christian anarchism, and a lot of the time it like is kind of wild, right? Like if you think about like Ammon Hennessy, a guy who is associated with the Catholic worker movement, his Christian anarchism is extremely bizarre. Or like even Dorothy Day, her Christian anarchism is motivated by lots of things, the Bible for sure, but Catholic social teaching and so on. This kind of stuff in the late 2000s was really motivated by, I think, a lot of those evangelical principles, right? A certain view of the Bible, a certain view of biblical authority, all that kind of stuff. And I thought that was very interesting as like an 18-year-old at the time, and that's probably when you're like the ripest for those that like weird confluence of an extremely confident worldview and like a sort of safely alternative political culture. So anyway, Shane Claiborne wrote this book, Jesus for President, where he makes this argument in that kind of cultural space that the Bible has this idea of Jesus as kind of like, the topsy turvy God who comes into the world and like messes up all our categories. And he has this reading of this passage, and I should say too, it's Shane Claiborne
That's
and
right.
Chris Hawes, the other guy, but I don't know. Shane Claiborne is like
Yeah,
a
totally.
higher profile, I guess. But they wrote the book together. Who knows who wrote this paragraph I'm about to read? Anyway, this paragraph I think really kind of got me thinking for the first time about all this stuff. So they say this: Jesus rode a donkey into Passover. Remember that Passover was the anti imperial Jewish festival during which the Jews celebrated their ancestors coming out of Egyptian slavery. With Roman soldiers lining the street, Jews gathered and waved palm branches, symbols of resistance to the empire. Passover was a volatile time, often marked by riots and bloodshed. Recall that Antipas killed thousands of Jews in the streets at the festival. When Jesus rode a donkey into the festival, it was a lampoon like street theater at a protest. Scholars call it the anti-triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Imagine the president riding a unicycle in the 4th of July parade. Well, kings did not ride donkeys. They rode mighty war horses accompanied by an entourage of soldiers. So here is Jesus making a spectacle of violence and power, riding in on the back of an ass, and a borrowed one at that. And it's all very sort of, I don't know, safely
Yeah.
radical language, I think you could say. But it does actually pull out in a really accessible way some of those political overtones, right? That when Jesus does this really wild thing, it is happening, it's true, at a super politically volatile moment. It is also happening right in the middle of a festival that commemorates people throwing off their oppressors and moving to a new place and being a unique people. There's also the backdrop of like, the failed Maccabean revolution that happened right before Jesus. All that kind of stuff is kind of in the air. And so then Jesus comes in, announcing this like different kind of authority, or kind of parodying Rome's military authority in these really interesting and complicated ways. So I still have a soft spot in my heart, I guess, for that passage, just because it like unlocked a piece of my brain that was like, "Whoa, there's something wild going on in the Bible."
Yeah, totally. Let's talk more about the book here for a hot second. So, Jesus for President is a very wild book, and like you said, Dean, it's like it is safely radical. That's maybe a good way of putting it, and we can talk about maybe some of the downfalls of that in a minute. But in preparation for this episode, I did look through my copy of Jesus for President to find this particular passage, and I had completely forgotten how cool the book is, like, as a sort of an
Hmm.
aesthetic piece. It's all sort of, like, very zine aesthetic, and then everything's cut out
Yeah.
letters and, like, sort of, like, things photocopied on the pages. I think I've spent a lot of time, like, sort of scoffing at this book in my more mature adult years, but, looking back at it, I can totally see why I was into it. I think it's very cool. It looks cool as a book, and there's something, the safe radicality of it, especially during the late Bush years, the early Obama years. I think there's something like very sort of appealing as a line of flight away from evangelicalism or conservative Christianity or something. So the book has a pretty, um, I think there's a good purpose to it. It's just maybe I would do some things differently in it myself. That's okay.
Yeah, I haven't read it since I was probably 18 or 19, but I guess if I looked at it again, there are like young teens that I could imagine recommending a book like that to for sure.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Okay. Well, we can talk about maybe some of the interesting like street theater connections in a minute, but I guess let's talk about like what's happening in this particular passage from Shane Claiborne. Maybe I should have done that before I talked about how cool the book looks. That's okay. Whatever. Okay, so this particular theme that Shane Claiborne is picking up on here, that Jesus is sort of this like countercultural force. He's a guy who's like playing with the political themes of the day and subverting them. That's a theme that I think Shane Claiborne picks up on a lot in the Bible. He's always kind of pulling this out where people, the prophets or whoever, they're always kind of finding the political powers of the day sort of like hollow and unauthentic or I don't know bad to say the least.
Mhm.
and like trying to turn them on their head. That's kind of like one of Shane Claiborne's, I think, key observations about biblical texts. And I don't know, I think he's probably right about a lot of them. The way that this actually works out, though, in like the weird sort of like this like weird sort of milieu of like Christian left during this time, though, I think is far more
Mhm.
interesting and complicated. Because what you get is like this when people talk about the the topsy turvy world of Jesus, or the upside down world kingdom of God, or what this passage means when Jesus kind of subverts the imagery of a king riding in on a donkey rather than like a war horse or whatever. You get these like senses in which political power is something to be like kind of scoffed at or rejected outright, or to be something that like that you're so suspicious of that you'd kind of like think that politics is maybe about something else other than power. Um,
Mhm.
and I think that's kind of a problem. There's sort of there's something cool here, I guess, for sure, right? Like that what Shane Claiborne is picking up on here is true and is right, and I think is interesting. But I think the way that the particular like strain of like the biblicist Christian anarchist or whatever of that like that early 2000s period, like what they do with it, I think ends up being kind of politically weak and limp. I don't know. What it means is like you should live in the world in a way that makes fun of it rather than tries to like change it or something. And that's sort of a bummer, I think.
Yeah, I think that is right. I mean, like I said, I have a real soft spot for this book and for that time in my life for sure. And I don't want to be like too crabby about it because it's, I don't know. I guess I owe it something, and I want to sort of honor that, and it's cool. But it's true there are these limitations that are present, and I think you kind of hit on the biggest one, which is how it understands the kind of lesson of these things. So, like for example, Jesus comes in and he is sort of parodying Roman imperial power, and I think that is totally true and right. And Jesus then goes on to flip the tables, so there's something kind of more active happening there too. And I guess the question is sort of what do you take away from these kinds of radical moments where Jesus is like doing something performative? And I think it's, it would be fair to say, and we too should do some kind of performative wild stuff to kind of, provide some alternatives or create a bit of a parodic theater piece. And we could talk more about the utility of that in a moment. But what the value of those things in general are not to sort of say we've kind of we've consumed the spectacle and learned the lesson that yeah the Roman Empire is something we can make fun of, but rather to say, well, what happens when you do kind of come to that realization? Like, what's step two after you're like, okay, Roman imperialism can be challenged, or there's this kind of way of making fun of it in this upside down way. And I think it's more helpful to sort of see Jesus as like clearing a path or opening up some space that is like foreclosed by all these imperial myths and stuff like that. And the question then is kind of what do you do in that space? And if you just stay at the event of kind of clearing the path, then you'll, you won't know where to like take a few steps.
Hmm.
And that is very important if you want to change an unjust political system. Like somebody has to be able to fill in that space. And if it's not you who's inspired by that topsy turvy Jesus moment, then it's going to be somebody else who does not care about
Right.
it.
In the work of in this book, Jesus for President, Shane Claiborne towards the end lays out some things of like, like what would the world look like were we to kind of like pick up this style of politics, this understanding of power, this understanding of Jesus, like what would it look like? And like I don't want to cast aspersions because nothing he says is bad. I don't think it's like harmful in any way, or is it even? I mean, it's. I think in a lot of ways it's desirable. It's like it's building community, it's building solidarity. It's like doing sort of like the sort of the stuff that you might call like lifestyle anarchism or something. Food not bombs. You feed people, and that's all very good stuff. Like there's nothing wrong with it whatsoever. But it does not like fundamentally call into question the power that is, right? It's still like, it exists alongside capital without really causing any problems for it whatsoever. So I
Mhm.
guess what I'm here to say is like, the like you're saying, Jesus opens up a space here and makes you kind of like think about things differently, but like what's the next step? And I don't know. Um, I think the next steps that are in Jesus for President are kind of wanting for sure, which is fine. I mean, whatever. but there's also a way you can turn this particular like understanding of Jesus as being like someone who's just like who's sort of like parodying power that can get transformed into like a rejection of power altogether. And I think that's
Hmm.
bad. That's a that's an impulse to maybe stay
Hmm.
off.
Well, we should return to the question of power maybe toward the end of the episode, but I think it's worth spending some time kind of parsing out even a little bit more just this moment or this event though, because I guess if the limitation of Jesus for president is that it can't really get beyond the spectacle, the sort of strength of it is that it does kind of do a good job making the spectacle,
Yeah.
visible or accessible. And I think it's actually something we don't really talk about much on this show, but there is a long, very interesting tradition of kind of political parody or political street theater that I think both Matt and I have kind of like a deep soft spot for, a deep love for. When we were like first becoming friends, I remember the two of us like being like, "Have you heard of this person? Yes. Have you heard of that person? Yes." It's all like very fun activists out there doing some really wild stuff. So it might be worth just spending some time talking about that theme of radical street theater. So, just to kind of put us back in perspective here, what I really want to say is if we can read Palm Sunday as a moment of radical street theater, we can maybe also understand that kind of in dialogue with like contemporary forms of radical street theater and just kind of figure out like what would it be like to both see Palm Sunday as in kind of resonance with these wild events that have been going on in our own time, and then vice versa to kind of figure out, well, what would Palm Sunday open up for us in the same way that these other things do. So, Matt, let's just start at the top. Maybe what's one of your favorite examples of radical street theater?
Yeah, well, let's start in the '60s with some French guys, and then we'll kind of work our way chronologically forward.
Yeah, okay, sure.
It wouldn't be an episode of our podcast unless we did start in the '60s with some French guys. That's the way. That's the way we like to do things here in this podcast. So, in the 1960s in France, it was a wild time to be there. Apparently, there's a group of dirty political theorists. I imagine them as dirty in my head. I have no idea. Maybe they were.
I imagine them as very clean.
Really? Oh man, you can never tell with these guys, I guess. There's a sort of a group of sort of like artists and philosophy kind of people, grad students, all kinds of like, very interesting intellectuals who kind of gather together under this banner called the Situationist International. And the Situationists International, they stem from another sort of art group called the Letterists. That's not important for the story, but the Situationists are, let's see, the person who's like really important, the sort of like as the person who's really important as the sort of theoretical mind of this movement is this guy named Guy Debord. There's another one called Raoul Vanayem, someone we've talked about a few times on the show, who wrote a big book about it's called The Revolution of Everyday Life, and also a book called The Brethren of the Free Spirit. But Guy Debord, he wrote this book called Society of the Spectacle, and it is a pretty wild book. It's very hard to read. It's French theory at its worst and best. But it had this like huge impact on I guess on activists in France. So the book is kind of a critique of Marx, honestly, but basically the big leap the book makes is that our political economy kind of has been it's now preceded by like the appearance of political economy. The appearance of society precedes the existence of our society, and that's kind of a crazy idea. But he's writing at a time like where TV is sort of new and it's like streaming into people's houses in this kind of radical way, and the advertising world is out of control, and all kinds of things like that are happening, kind of booming around him in France. And making these observations about the ways that capitalism trades in images and in signs and symbols and ideas just as much as it does trade in like actual like things that you produce. So this guy Guy Debord and the rest of these other like French folks, they were like, well, what if there were ways we could hijack the spectacle? Like, what if we could kind of like find ways to bend all of like the mass media to say something more interesting or more true, or funny that would kind of like pull at the strings or pull at the seams of capitalism. So there's this word that kind of comes out of these conversations. That's a French word that I'll say wrong. That's okay because I'm not French. And the word is détournement. It means to like to hijack, to turn against. Hijack is probably the best way to put it in the United States, though, or in English.
Mhm.
So what they would do was, they would take like a comic strip and change all the words so it was about capitalism. Or famously, there's a movie that one of these folks made because well, DeBoer himself was a filmmaker, and some of the other situationists were also filmmakers. And they would, anyways. There's a sort of famous example of détournement from the situationists called in a movie called "Can Dialectics Break Bricks," which is a great title. But
Mhm.
it's a kung fu movie, and sort of all of its problematic appearance. But all of the subtitles have been changed to be sort of like about socialism, about Marxism, about the like French Communist Party, all these kind of like very inside baseball jokes about French left politics at the time. And I gotta tell you, it's on YouTube. You can watch it. I've tried to, and I don't really understand any of it, which is fine. But anyways, they kind of came up with these ideas about hijacking culture. Not the first example I think probably ever of street theater because Jesus did before them, and I'm sure there are people between them for sure. But it's people who are thinking about the ways that media intervenes in capitalism while also being created out of sort of a capitalist political economy, and the ways that you can kind of hijack those things and turn it against itself, and how that becomes a very interesting thing. So all that to say, street theater has a long history that precedes the 1960s in France for sure. Um, but there's a sort of an interesting intervention that these weird French folks made to use media to use capitalist media against capitalism.
Mhm. Yeah, and that theme of détournement is so interesting and fun. It kind of comes around, I don't know, like all themes, they're around long enough to be sort of commercialized or watered down or whatever. So you can find lots of examples of it. Maybe the most famous one that people love to love or hate is the magazine Adbusters, which was also very popular when Shane
That's true.
Claiborne's book came out. Sort of a
Oh,
perfect.
there's kind of a similar energy, honestly, between those two
For sure,
things.
for sure. Well, and G's magazine is actually kind of not completely related to all that, but not totally
Yeah.
apart from it either. Anyway, a lost world to time. But Adbusters, you can still probably go get it at a bookstore, I guess. You can buy it at a Barnes and Noble. That's probably the best place to buy it because it really highlights a lot about it. But
Yeah, for sure.
anyway, Adbusters is a magazine that is what it sounds like. It's like a bunch of advertisements that the people who make the magazine sort of mess with and juxtapose and sort of, I don't know, chop and screw and all that kind of stuff, and then they will publish essays and all that kind of alongside it, right? And that is like maybe the most sort of consumer friendly version of Détournement, but yeah, it comes around in lots of different ways, and it's a really fun concept because there's a certain sense of play in it. There's also a sense of like, I don't know, creativity involved that sometimes you don't get on the left. I mean, this is definitely like a new left phenomenon, right? You can't imagine a bunch
Mhm.
of old left sort of like
Like steel workers.
exactly, yeah, like a bunch of 60-year-old steelworkers who are like about to retire. They're not going to like sit down at the old steelworkers union hall and like cut up a magazine and figure out how to make it say something else, right? This is like appealing to young people, to the student movement, all that kind of stuff in the late 60s. And I think it's fun. It's a cool way to maybe think through a little bit about what Jesus is doing, right? He doesn't live in a massive spectacle ridden society full of TVs or anything, but you can see him kind of metabolizing the symbols that are around him, right? Taking it all in, digesting it, and doing something different. Trying to play with those symbols in order to subvert them. So it's like instead of the big war horse coming in to Jerusalem, surrounded by an entourage of captives and soldiers, Jesus is coming into Jerusalem on a donkey that he like borrowed, that his disciples stole from somebody, and so like the Lord needs this, and is coming in. And instead of having an entourage of slaves, Jesus is pronouncing all the slaves are supposed to go free. Instead of coming in with a bunch of soldiers in an occupying show of force, the people themselves are kind of giving Jesus this people's greeting, a people's welcome, with the palms that they would use to protest Roman imperialism, right? So Jesus is making fun of Roman imperial rule precisely by like, yeah, doing a bit of a détournement here to be a little anachronistic, right? Just playing around with those symbols.
Yeah, totally. I think it's a great way to connect those things. Another bit of street theater that comes to mind. This is maybe not street theater, but like interesting sorts of play with symbols and being kind of goofy at the same time while also kind of making a political point. This is, I think, in the chronology that we have here of the things of the examples. This might be the one that comes next, which is a pretty big gap. But anyways, in January 2000, so a long time ago, but again around the Jesus for President era. What a weird time capsule this episode actually is. I'm thinking about it. Anyways, in January 2000, the Zapatista Air Force attacked
Mhm.
the Mexican federal soldiers. A scary thing. The Zapatistas, if you're not familiar, is a sort of like a leftist, but also indigenous movement in the southern part of Mexico. They are have ties to sort of like anarchist types of movements. They have sort of socialist currents within them as well.
Liberation
Uh,
theology.
yeah, totally. Yeah. We talked about them a handful of times. If you've never heard of Zapatistas, it's a good Google, a great rabbit hole to fall down. But the Zapatista Air Force in January 2000 did attack Mexican federal soldiers, um, but they did it in a pretty unconventional way. They did it with paper airplanes. That's right, folks. The Zapatistas flew like thousands of paper airplanes over a barbed wire fence into a military encampment, and each of the airplanes did carry a written quote missile with it, that was just like messages and poems for the soldiers inside the encampment. One of the missiles that the paper airplane carried said this: "Soldiers, we know that poverty has made you sell your lives and souls. I'm also poor, and so are millions. But you're worse off for defending our exploiter." Some pretty rough words, but a cool thing. I like this though because it's not street theater in sort of like the protesty sense, but it is theater in I think the same way that Jesus is doing it. Right? It's like it's recognizing the tools of empire, right? An air force, and just like Jesus rejects the big war horse for like a donkey, the Zapatistas say, "Oh, an air force? No, we have paper airplanes." Right? It's kind of trading in a type of like bait and switch symbolism that's kind of playing off one another and makes a sort of funny moment.
Yeah, I like that. That's a great example. That sort of parody, right? Adopting even the title Zapatista Air Force is so funny. It's great. I think that's probably actually a very good analogy for what's going on in Palm Sunday. One other thing, this is kind of like, I don't know, a connection that just I made in my brain right this second, so we'll see if it goes anywhere. I keep telling people that I have these insights from Peter Sloterdijk, a weird German philosopher that you shouldn't read. So I guess maybe that's the service I'm providing. Is I've read too much of him, so I'm just going to give you the highlights. But he did write this book that I think is probably actually genuinely interesting, called "The Critique of Cynical Reason." And it's a book about cynicism and about why it's a political problem. And I don't know about you, but I have been a very cynical person in my life.
Oh, me never.
Yeah, hard not to be. And Sloterdijk has this really interesting sort of analysis of cynicism. You know, it is politically debilitating. It's the kind of thing he calls it enlightened false consciousness, which is actually a very funny kind of phrase, right?
Mm.
Because if you have enlightened consciousness, it shouldn't be false. So I love that kind of parody or paradox. Anyway, the whole premise that Sloterdijk sort of puts forward is we live in these societies in capitalism that are like deeply like they force you to distrust everything all the time. But instead of really organizing ourselves to defeat it, we kind of get satisfied with like knowing better than everybody
Yeah.
else. So if you know the secret behind everything, it might bum you out, but like at least you know better than somebody else. And so the
Mhm.
key is to really, to be cynical. The more cynical you are, the stronger you are. And I don't know, anybody who's ever scrolled Twitter for 5 minutes, I think it's like it's a
Yeah.
pretty big political problem. So Sloterdijk's solution to it, this is where I think he goes a little bit, not maybe in the total direction I'd like to go, but not in a way that is useless either. His solution is not, therefore, we need to have, organized sort of labor and all the rest of it to try to destroy these whatever kind of material basis for cynicism. Instead, he says what we have to do is get in touch with this more ancient tradition that he calls cynicism. So in English, it's the same thing like cynicism, cynic, like cynic, but in the ancient sense, it starts with a K, kynic. And for Sloterdijk, cynicism is kind of rooted in ancient philosophy of cynicism, so Diogenes and all these folks. And he traces this kind of ancient tradition of cynicism from Diogenes up through Jesus. He thinks Jesus is in this tradition. He talks about St. Francis as well as being in this tradition. And what these all have in common is that whereas in modern cynicism, we're all kind of like stuck in our brains, repeating these algorithms of like depression, of being smarter about how bad it is all the time. Instead of that, there's this kind of ancient way of being that is way more into like a performative act of sort of revealing that the body has its own joy that can't really be contained. So, for example, like Diogenes, the Greek philosopher, there's a famous story of Alexander the Great like stepping over him, and I forget what he says to Diogenes, but I don't know, something that emperors say to people. And Diogenes says, "Get out of my son," and that's like the philosopher's resistance to imperial power. And you kind of get the same thing here with Jesus on Palm Sunday, right? That there's this kind of bodily way of knowing, this rootedness or like centeredness that is refusing to be cynical, but instead being cynical, being kind of tied into a sort of a resistant joy that you can't really get rid of, right? And you see that in the Christian tradition pop up in St. Francis and other places as well. And I think about that a lot in my own life, right? Like, I'm involved in lots of organizations that are trying to do organized things to make the world change, but it's not going to change overnight. And so, how do we tap in even to those kind of parts of the Christian tradition that encourage us to, like, allow ourselves to live a little bit alternatively, even if we know that that's not really like, the sort of conclusion, I guess, or moral to the story. It is still actually a very important way of like both surviving in the world and also maybe there's something to kind of providing, just that symbol of weirdness that you're a little bit out of step with what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's cool. A really a helpful word actually. People are too cynical in the bad way, not in the good way.
Yeah.
Well, there is something that's I mean, I think that's a good connection to make though, especially when it comes to like other types of like street theater, especially ones that are maybe like more joyful and interesting than a kung fu movie that's been redubbed or something. A shared interest you and I both have, Dean, is the Reverend Billy Talon, who's not he's I he's a reverend, I guess, in the way that it matters, but not in, like, the official sense. If you've never heard of the Reverend Billy Talon before, let me tell you about him right now. He's pretty famous for a documentary. Dean, what's the documentary called? What Would Jesus Buy?
Yeah, I think that is the title of it.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so, it's a movie about consumerism and how it's bad, and I like that about it. But really the sub story beneath it is it follows this guy, Reverend Billy Talon, who in all of the signs and signifiers of his personal body is like like a sort of like Southern preacher, like a really like, a real righteous gems kind of guy,
Yeah,
honestly.
yeah.
He's ready to sing with the choir. He's ready to preach and like kind of get fire and brimstone about it. But he doesn't ever really talk about like Jesus. I guess he does in some sense. He talks about God too, but not in like an explicitly Christian way, I think. But he's there to tell you that you shouldn't be a mindless consumer. You shouldn't be a slave to capitalism. um, and a part of the movie, at least, is how he and his sort of like cadre of fellow activists organized this like church choir to tour the country and go to these different churches and sing songs about how you ought not just like buy things during Christmas and like kind of call it a day. Some great street theater. They like sing in like department stores and kind of do some like more guerrilla activist kind of moments, and they get kicked out of them and get arrested and all kinds of fun stuff like that. But again, another great example though of people like living in such a way and performing in such a way where they understand the context, they understand the certain performative aspect and what people are expecting out of them, and then they change a bit of the content so it's hijacked and it ends up kind of like cutting against that which they are kind of performing, and it's this really confusing but very cool thing.
Hmm. Yeah, there's an awesome clip from that documentary I remember where they're in the Mall of America, and it's like a bunch of people in robes, and they're going up and down escalators singing songs about like why you shouldn't buy anything. And it is the funniest thing in the world because the sheer aesthetic of it, I think, like makes people do a bit of a double take. Like everyone's like, this must be fine because they're like good Christian people doing a big song or
Yeah.
whatever. And it's only like Reverend Billy Talon has a megaphone, and he just like escalates and gets like more and more explicit and intense, and that's when they finally kick him out. And I love that as well. It's kind of like, appropriating the fact that like nobody's really going to say that you shouldn't preach the gospel in the Mall of America, even if it's weird. But like once you start saying, and you shouldn't buy stuff here, like then it's a real issue, and I love that.
Yeah, yeah, for real. Well, okay, so we have a few of these examples of like street theater and hijacking out on the table here, Jesus included, right? um, and I think what's interesting in these examples is, again, I'm not here to dunk on Shane Claiborne. I don't think I need to do that, but I do want to draw out, I guess, a little bit of a critique. Is that like um, that in these different examples, like there's organization, there's power, and there's like people kind of involved in them. And those people aren't like backing down, they're like escalating, I guess. And they're using these like kind of moments of street theater as like things to organize around, right? And I think that I don't know, you could probably say something really similar in the case of Jesus as well, right? He's coming into Jerusalem, this very important city, during a really important time of like the Jewish calendar. That's all there. Like the people are like really riled up when Jesus gets there. The disciples are really riled up when they get there. The the wrong people are really riled up when they get there as well. Um, and there's like, I mean, I think just like the Church Stop Shopping, like Billy Talon, like the Zapatistas or whatever, there's something similar going on, and that the action is there to like build power and not just like confront spectacle and leave or something. But I guess the way that I read Shane Claiborne is, and maybe wrongly, I don't know, is that like, the thing that we're supposed to take away from the Palm Sunday sort of entrance into Jerusalem is that like Jesus is not the type of president, not the type of ruler, not the type of king that you're expecting. So we should like kind of detach ourselves from that type of political power altogether. Whereas I think the real way to read it is that this is, this is an organizing tool. This is an expression of real power, but and not something that you're just gonna like walk away from afterwards.
Yeah, I think too that's really the key. Like we were saying earlier, I guess the key is to see, well, what is Jesus sort of opening, or what space is getting cleared by doing something wild like that. It's like when Reverend Billy Talon goes to the Mall of America and does this big thing. A lot of people, I'm sure, who were shopping that day just went home and were like, I saw this wild thing happen at the mall. I've never seen anything like it. And that was kind of the end of it. It's like something they talk about during the day. But you have to find a way to build a bridge between those kind of events and the next sort of step, right? Organizing, figuring out how to actually keep the momentum going. Jesus follows up that action with the next sort of bit of street theater of turning over the tables in the temple. But by the time you get to the Book of Acts, right, Jesus gets beamed up to heaven. The response of the early Christians is actually like not to go out and do a bunch of street theater, or not even necessarily to like totally drop out, but it's to like form a community, right? A primitive communist community, sharing everything in common, holding all those things together, and that is like an organized, coordinated thing to do. And I guess that's sort of where Jesus for President got me excited as a teen, but leaves me a little bit with lots of questions as a person who is not a teen anymore. Right? Like what's the kind of actionable piece? And I have a lot of respect for someone like Shane Claiborne who does live in like an intentional community, or at least did at that time. And that's all very cool. But at the end of the day, like capitalism is an exploitative political economy that is totally fine to allow people to live in some intentional communities at the margins of its society. Like if we really want to confront the empire, like if what Jesus is doing is kind of showing that imperial power doesn't have the last word and showing us too that you can make fun of it and kind of clear a space to think about a different kind of kingdom, then that means also thinking about the material basis for capitalism, which is not just the stories that we tell. Like it is certainly involved in the stories that we tell about ourselves and power and so on, but it's also the material way in which, we go to work every day and like take a paycheck or don't, and stay on the job or don't. And I think that's the piece that's often missing in progressive Christian circles, that lots of Christians are very good at saying the stories we tell are bad, and we should tell the biblical story instead. But they're not so good, in my experience, at kind of asking that structural question underneath.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's frustrating because, I mean, to build the Church of Acts, I mean, it would take that structural piece, right? It would take the work of like organizing and community building to really do it. But that's not the part of the story that we tell, or it's not the part that we kind of like conceptualize. Um, in these types of like movements in street theater, and especially with regards to Christianity and the ways that maybe it falls short sometimes, I've been thinking a lot about like, well, I don't know, like what people's movements look like and the ways that power kind of gets built within them. I've spent a lot of my life, as you can tell from this podcast, reading about weird French guys. And I've taken a detour lately. I've started reading about not weird and not French people at all. Lately, I've been really interested in these a handful of different organizations in the United States that kind of spring up that are extremely radical, but not like explicitly Marxist or socialist even. Throughout the 1980s, there's a handful of these organizations that pop up throughout the country called like the Union of the Homeless, and pretty fascinating activism actually. Um, and I think what I find really fascinating about these stories, this is completely out of left field, by the way. I'm sorry, I'm just kind of throwing this out here right now. But like, what's really interesting about like the Union of the Homeless or some of these related organizations is that like they really rely deeply on the organizing power of people, and like that's it. Because like that's really all anyone has is sort of like their physical presence and ability to be in a place and kind of like talk to people. Um, when they talk about power and they talk about organizing, of course, like theatrics can be a part of it, and I think sometimes they were. But power, as they conceptualize it, like politically, it comes out of those people who are organizing to actually do something. And the cool street theater stuff is always sort of like, um, can be a piece of that organizing. And I guess like that's great. But yeah, I would hate I would hate to like walk away too quickly from the street theater as like a cool event that makes us think differently about the world without recognizing that like those are opportunities to actually build power and to kind of pull people in and to like to do more.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess the Zapatista Air Force maybe is the way of kind of squaring it all, right? It's like a very funny joke, a very cool piece of kind of artistic expression and performance, but it's also tied into an ongoing actual political struggle. And the goal is to conscientize the soldier, right? To be like, you're poor, I'm poor, and like so much the worse for you because you're on that side of the fence. Um, and maybe that's it, right? Trying to think through what does it mean to tie those spectacles to something that's really going on. I think even the example that you brought out of the Union of the Homeless and stuff like that, like in Toronto, there are all kinds of interesting organizations that do really good work organizing people who are not just workers, like the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, for example, which is kind of a similar sort of thing. And there's all kinds of sort of like, I don't think it would be right to call them, theater or guerrilla theater, because they're not, performing anything on purpose. But there's this kind of performative moment of them, like, occupying like all the space outside the mayor's condo or
Mm,
something, right? And like just causing a big scene. Like that's the idea. Like get a bunch of attention on this particular area so that you can then get an excuse to talk, right? To the press, to media, to other people who are around, all that kind of stuff. The same when like the police are clearing out an encampment, right? Like it's about creating a big scene, a big ruckus around all of that, so that you can not let that just happen, right? But the key is to plug those folks into some kind of organizing structure over time. Otherwise, you just get these flashes of activity And that's what successful people's movements do. They connect the dots of those flashes, right? They sustain all the energy that's happening in between. So I don't know. This is, like you said, maybe getting far afield from Palm Sunday, but I guess the key is to be like, as we think about Palm Sunday, as we're going to church thinking about Palm Sunday, it's like, what space does that open up maybe in our brains to think differently, and how do we connect that kind of sort of signal that Jesus is giving us to, some other means of organizing?
Yeah, I mean, it is and it's not a far afield from Palm Sunday because I guess like the impulse within me is thinking like I'm going to hear a sermon or whatever on Palm Sunday that's probably saying something that's just like Jesus, you expect this king, but he's actually this different kind of person. If we kind of follow Jesus, we end up like think about political power differently. We think about all kinds of things differently, and I guess I just like hate I hate the idea that anyone would leave it at that point only. That kind of bumps
Hmm.
me out. So I guess to me the connection to like organizing I think is the piece that really makes me like feel like it's worth something. So
Hmm.
there you go,
Hmm.
folks.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast.
Support us. The Lord needs it.
That's right. The Lord does need it. Send us your donkeys. Our music is by Amoria Armstrong. Our outro is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early.